Yes, I'm just going to talk for about 1 minute and then leave Rachel to talk in more depth about the media work. We're doing a wide range of work on adolescent girls and broadly on adolescent girls' empowerment, and that's using a full capability framework. And the important aspect of this is how interlinked it is. So looking at owning economic assets, having control over physical integrity and sexual and reproductive rights, being able to express one's voice politically and socially, becoming educated. These are all capabilities which multiple interventions and policies are aiming to achieve. And you can't address one without addressing the others, and I think that's probably the fundamental point of our research. We can't address early marriage without considering education or family assets. We can't enhance voice without addressing political rights and self-esteem and the right to congregate. So we've been working in 4 countries to explore adolescent girls and social norms and the context in which they're seeking to achieve their capabilities and the policies and programs which operate to support this. And the review that we're going to talk about is quite a comprehensive review. We call it a review with systematic principles, which means that we've looked very closely at the methodology of the projects that we've analysed to weed out the best and then to analyse how effective they were. And Rachel will talk about particularly the media projects. We felt that looking at communication initiatives was important because it's a gap in terms of understanding what it is that works. So I'll just hand on to Rachel now.
So we looked at 61 communication initiatives, quite a broad range. Some were mass media, community-based programs, sort of information and education and communication programs, things like billboards and posters and so on, and life skills programs that gave girls information about their rights, often in a very participatory way that enabled them to slowly develop self-confidence and learn key information about their rights and their bodies and so on at the same time. But I'll just focus on the 20 media programs or programs that had a media content in this discussion. And before I go any further, I'd like to also mention my co-author Ella Page, who's sitting at the back over there, and we did this review together over the course of about a year. So what did we find? Well, we found that there were stronger changes in attitudes and practices. These media interventions spanned the globe, spanned low and middle income countries. Some were in Latin America, some in India, quite a few in sub-Saharan Africa. We found that they had changed attitudes towards gender equality in general, towards what people aspired to for their sons and their daughters. Some of the Indian programs changed how people saw the value of having a son or a daughter in places where typically people had been less than overjoyed at the birth of a daughter. Now it was perhaps being seen in a new light. We found changing attitudes towards domestic violence, and people starting to think that it was less acceptable to hit wives or girlfriends. And we found strong evidence of change in attitudes towards girls' education, with much more valuing of girls' education. We also found changes in practice and behaviour, though there were fewer of them. There certainly were noticeable changes, so more sending of girls to school, more evidence of equal treatment of children, people giving their boys and girls the same kind of food, people being more willing to listen to girls' opinions as well as boys' opinions in the family. We also found some evidence of changes outside the home. So some examples again from India of girls being less seen to be talking to boys in public. In the past, if they were seen talking to boys in public, that could mean only one thing, that they were engaging in affairs with those boys, and people were starting to see that actually they could be talking to them innocently about education or about improving things in their community. And there was some evidence as well of girls participating more in community decision making. I'll explain that enigmatic "don't be a fataki" as well. One of the studies we looked at was a soap opera, radio soap opera, that was trying to encourage men to not be sugar daddies, and they created this villainous character Fataki. And this had real resonance, and the researchers overheard one young man chatting to his friend, don't be a fataki, you can't do that, leave that girl alone. But we did also find some mixed evidence. It wasn't all positive. As I said, we found that changes in attitudes were greater than changes in practice. We found evidence that some programs had made little change to attitudes on things like sun preference. It depended very much on the program. Well, some radio programs had gone a long way, others hadn't done so well. We also found some evidence from Southern Africa which suggested increased reporting of sexual violence among young viewers and listeners. Now, this isn't clear whether this meant that more sexual violence was happening, or that people were more aware of sexual violence and the things that they had perhaps accepted in the past were crimes and were unacceptable forms of violence. So this points to problems with the quality of evidence, which, even though we used the best quality and most rigorous studies, even so there were a number of problems with the quality of evidence, and not least because the studies didn't always look at the same things that we wanted to look at. They were set up on their own terms to evaluate programs that were intending to achieve certain things. Often the impacts on girls were almost byproducts, and they'd not set out to achieve them, but they found that they did. Caroline referred to the MENA Communication Initiative in South Asia and about how inspiring that was for girls, how it opened their eyes to opportunities that they might not have had otherwise. But we know that it's important that because of these limitations, there are also ways to make media interventions more effective in empowering adolescent girls. So the kinds of things that seem to make a difference, and I think many of these will be well known to media professionals in the room, but perhaps the development sector hasn't taken them on board so much. Things like having sympathetic characters, like Mina, a very feisty but polite young girl who a lot of people could engage with, or good villains like Fataki, people who you definitely didn't want to be like him. Repetition, the same issues over and over again, and tackling issues head on. I mean, interestingly, there didn't seem to be much of a case of making change by stealth. There's a degree of stealth by putting things in soap operas, but at the same time, unless those soap opera episodes did, for example, show a grandmother sharing out a mango equally between a son and a daughter, or showed men modelling positive gender egalitarian attitudes, things weren't going to change. One of the studies we looked at that tried to get some change on attitudes to women working outside the home without their husband's permission kind of wove it into a drama on family planning and really made no change at all because it was too hidden. Additional discussion components came up in some of the studies that's really important. Things like listener groups, where people could discuss what they'd heard in radio broadcasts. And then also emerging from our study, the importance of not just targeting adolescent girls, of making storylines and messages appeal to other stakeholders, the people who have power, who make decisions about girls' lives. So again, Amina, that sympathetic character. What don't we know? Well, with any systematic review, it always raises a lot of questions about the quality of evidence and what you don't know as well as what you can say. I think we don't know very much about the limitations of media-based activity. What proportion of people will not change their behaviour or attitudes as a result of media exposure. There's going to be a hardcore who fundamentally disagree with the issues they put forward or are not motivated to change, as well as people who are excluded because they don't have access to the media. And this may differ with different issues as well, people's resistance. We know that there is value in integrating communications and non-communications activities. Our study found that the programs that had additional activities, so that perhaps involved life skills training or vocational skills training, as well as media activities, generally had a greater degree of impact. But we know very little about best practice in doing this, and there are far too few studies, and perhaps too few actual interventions out there doing this to really know what's the best way to integrate communication and communication activities, and likewise, what's the best mix of media and other communication activities? How often should a listener group meet, or how much posters or stickers or branded rubbers or pens, or what degree of that is necessary to really achieve change. And we also know very little about how far these changes were sustainable in the long run. So Most of the studies evaluated change after a year or two maximum after the end of the programme. One study, which was actually not of media, it was a more communicative-based discussion, went back after 7 years, and most of the young people could remember very little about it and had not been able to put much into practice. Now, that might be quite different with memorable storylines that they've seen on television or heard on the radio, but we don't really know. We don't know if girls have been able to carry those new attitudes forward into married life, or if young men who've watched soaps that promoted gender equality have carried that forward as they got married and treated their daughters with equally to their sons and so on. So that's an area that definitely more research is needed.
Okay, that's brilliant. And just we've actually had a question online, and welcoming more questions online when we open it to you guys to ask questions. But this one's particularly relevant to your last point, which was how do they measure the changes in attitude? What are the indicators?
Well, they varied very much per issue, because we looked at a lot of different issues. We looked at changes in attitudes to education, or changes in attending school, changes in attitudes to violence or reporting of violence, changes in practicing of FGMC or attitudes to it, and so on. So, it was all about changes in attitudes and changes in reported practice. And of course, people may not be telling the complete truth. They may be saying what they think the researchers want them to say. So that's another caveat we have to put in the mix as we try and assess, exactly how much change these programs achieved.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.